Dr. Caldwell. Welcome here. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's good to talk with you.
Of course, thank you. So I was wondering if for the start you can give us a little bit of background about yourself and maybe about the high pass education.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Ben Caldwell. I'm a licensed MFT here in California, and I am the president of High Pass Education, and we do educational resources. So we do license exam prep, we do continuing education, we've got a California law textbook, basically resources to help therapists advance more knowledgeably in their careers.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. So, what are some of the common challenges or difficulties for candidates who want to take all these different licensure exams in California and also in the US? There are a variety of them, right? So, if you can talk about that for a little bit for our audience.
Yeah, so one of the challenges people run into is just that there are a lot of different exams.
Mhm.
Depending on what mental health profession you are in the US, you probably have a well, you almost certainly have a clinical exam that you have to take that is different between each profession. And also, if you're an MFT, is different in California from the rest of the country. In addition to a clinical exam, you might also have to take a usually state-based jurisprudence exam. And that kind of an exam addresses legal and ethical issues, sometimes with crisis intervention thrown in there as well. But the requirements are pretty inconsistent from one state to another in terms of what specific exams you might need to take, in addition to when you are considered eligible to take them.
Hmm. Many different things that you need to, I guess, like stay up to date about. So what are some of the approaches that you take at your organization to address some of these challenges if people want to use the services that you have?
So we know and this isn't unique to us, right? So a lot of exam prep providers are out there. They tend to offer really good stuff. And we all at this point do things fairly similarly. Um, so usually if you take an exam prep course, there's going to be some level of lecture, like just information sharing and organization. And that might be audio based or video based. Ours are video based. And there usually will be some discussion of anxiety management and some discussion of test taking skill. And test taking skill, I think, is a really important component because while exam developers have argued for a long time, like there are no secrets to passing these exams, it's really all about your knowledge. There is a wealth of research literature going back decades that makes very clear when it comes to passing a multiple choice test on any subject, your knowledge is important, but there is also a set of test-taking skills that can really help you to get over the bar. And that actually can make a meaningful difference in terms of who passes and who doesn't. So any good exam prep program should involve all of those components. Now, we're working at High Pass Education, just like other exam prep companies are, on differentiators, things that will set us apart in terms of how we provide information, how we do test practice and that kind of thing. Um, but at the end of the day, we're all focused on making sure that you understand the information, making sure that you can manage your anxiety, and making sure that you come in as well prepared as possible in that area of test taking skill.
Mhm. That makes a lot of sense. One of the things that I like you about Ben, many different qualities, but one of them is you keep having feedback for all these different exams that we have. And I remember this post that I don't know when, but at some point you posted on LinkedIn and you talked about how some people say like there's conflict between what you do and you keep criticizing. And you were mentioning that there's actually no conflict because I keep like advocating for things that we should have. And at the same time, in the meanwhile that we are having these exams, I'm helping people to go through their journey. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, so you're talking about the criticism that I've been leveling for a while at clinical exams in mental health care.
Mhm.
And I argue that we actually shouldn't have these exams at all.
Mhm.
There is no evidence, and I don't mean like just a little bit of evidence. I mean, there is not a shred of evidence anywhere in more than 60 years of clinical exams being used for mental health licensure in the US, no evidence that your performance on a clinical exam for mental health licensure correlates in any way with your future safety or effectiveness in practice. And that's a big deal because if you think about what exam developers and licensing boards claim that they are using these exams for, they say that they are about assessing knowledge of the profession for the purposes of ensuring public safety, right? That's what licensure is all about. And if an exam actually does not further the goal of public safety, if it doesn't predict in any way whether you are going to be safe in practice in the future, then it has no business as a requirement for licensure. And in fact, there is a ton of data showing that across these exams, they don't predict anything, but what they do correlate with very strongly is race and ethnicity. ASWB, which is the developer of the social work national exam, they put out a report in the fall of 2022, and they looked at 10 years of exam performance data disaggregated by race and ethnicity. And I will credit ASWB for this. They put out the data. Other exam developers have been really, really reluctant to do so, probably because of what that data is going to show. In the case of the ASWB report, if you are a white examinee and you're taking the social work clinical exam for the first time, your chance of passing that exam, at least in the 10 years of data that was in this report, was about 83 to 85%. If you were a Black examinee, your chance of passing that exam was more like 40 to 45%.
Wow.
That is an enormous
Wow.
difference. And there is simply no justification for continuing to use an exam that creates such a disparate barrier to licensure when there is no evidence whatsoever that that exam is connected with safety or effectiveness in actual clinical practice. Bear in mind here that the way these tests are structured, they're 4-option or 3-option multiple choice. And if you think about it, they bear very little resemblance to what we actually do in clinical practice, where you have the opportunity to ask follow-up questions, to use resources like the DSM, to consult with colleagues, and very rarely is any of that under significant time pressure. Whereas in a multiple choice exam, you can't ask follow-up questions, you can't consult with colleagues, you can't use the DSM, and you have to answer these questions very quickly. It is a separate skill set doing that compared to what we actually do to make treatment both safe and effective. And I understand why licensing boards and the professions themselves would want to use clinical exams, right? It looks professional. It looks like a high bar to licensure, when really all that it seems to do is make it harder for clinicians of color to get licensed. Now, going back to your question, you were saying that I'm criticizing these exams at the same time that I am offering exam prep resources. And what I say is there's actually no conflict at all between those two. I don't think the clinical exams should exist. And if the clinical exams were to be disavowed, discontinued tomorrow, like that's great. I'm good. I will find someplace else to put my time and energy. In the meantime, as long as we have these exams, as long as they are such a barrier to licensure, then I want to do the best I possibly can to help people get ready for them, to maximize their chance of passing so that they don't fail and have to spend hundreds of dollars more and months of additional time waiting to take the exam again. And in the meantime, not being a licensed person who can go out and serve their communities as a licensed mental health professional.
So many reactions to what you just shared. First of all, about that report, that percentage, I'm like, wow, like that's a huge difference. And it's somehow I feel like just even like hearing that or reading that, it's so like uncomfortable for me that I don't want, like, that's one reaction. And then I agree with you about the questions and the exams. I usually, when I talk to my students, I tell them when they ask about exam, I say like, the way, like the content is something else, but the way they ask the question, like it's just, if they ask you like that same content, let's say it's about a specific theory or whatever, like, and they ask you, hey, just talk about, answer this question, you can answer that question. But sometimes the way they ask that question, and then there are just four choices in front of you and you read them and like, this is right, this is right as well. And then, so there's the way they ask the question, it's tricky sometimes.
It
Um,
is absolutely, and I apologize for interrupting, but let me add on that point in particular. This is not a unique concern in the mental health world. This is sort of across standardized testing for different professions. During COVID, there was a test for medical professionals, doctors, coming in from other countries that was ostensibly a test of their medical skill that they would have to pass in order to obtain medical licensure in the US. And that specific test was paused and then ultimately discontinued entirely. And it was replaced with a test of English language comprehension. And the pass rate was almost identical, which suggests that what had all along been posing as a test of medical knowledge was actually probably, at least in part, and maybe largely, just a test of written English language comprehension. And it's not that that's unimportant for medical care, for mental health care, it is, but let's not pretend to be testing something other than what we are actually testing.
Yeah, exactly. You're so right. It's just about a standardized test, right? So I'm from Iran, and when I wanted to come to the US, I had to take like English tests, like TOEFL, IELTS, and the same things about them, right? So
Yeah.
you need to read this reading about physics and answer questions. And I'm like, if I read that in even in Farsi, in my native language, I don't know, like it's confusing. I don't know physics. So why should I know, like, be good at this test in English? Anyway, that's another criticism. But two things to what you shared with us. The first one is you mentioned data about like this whole subject. And that reminds me of just research studies. And since this is for YouTube channel of International Journal of Systemic Therapy, I was wondering if you can talk about some of the research or studies that if we have, or if it's like ongoing. And the second one is if we are thinking about the fact that these clinical tests are not the best options, do you have any alternative suggestion in mind to give the board?
Mhm. Yeah, those are both great questions. So let me talk about the research side
Mhm,
first.
mhm,
I mentioned that ASWB report specific to
mhm,
social work exams. In the world of family therapy, we've got the national MFT exam that is produced by AMFTRB, and then the California MFT clinical exam. And neither one of those has ever, neither sort of test developer has ever put out data on exam performance disaggregated by race or ethnicity. So a couple of MFT researchers, Diane Gayhart and Kevin Linus, they worked with a team of folks and just said, we're going to do this ourselves. We want to find out what's going on with the MFT exams. And so they used a survey approach and wound up with data that, man, looks awfully, awfully similar to what was in the ASWB report for social workers. And that's not particularly surprising. There's been similar study with similar results of what is called the EPPP, which is the National Clinical Exam for Psychologists. There hasn't really been research that I'm aware of anyway on the counselor exams, the NCE and the NCMHCE. But we have every reason to believe that if those were studied, uh, likely the results would be similar because we're talking about tests that are developed in very similar ways, structured in very similar ways. Um, if you look sort of internationally, there has been less research on exams as a component of professional licensure around the world, just because it's not as common of a process, certainly not done the same way. Um, there seems to be a lot more reliance on the supervision process and education, credentialing that way. In the US, we love to test people. And we love to do this standardized test process despite the very real concerns with its fairness. There was also a study that I published late last year that it wasn't original data gathering, but it was looking at the development processes for these exams and how they're implemented compared to standards of the testing industry. And it might get into a bit of the kind of regulatory weeds here, but all of these exam developers say that they are developing and using their tests in accordance with industry standards. And that winds up being an important phrase for why licensing boards feel justified to use these exams. But I went and actually looked at all of those standards in great detail and found that actually, no, there are many important standards in the testing industry that these mental health clinical exams do not appear to abide by. And fundamental issues of like protecting fairness, doing statistical analysis to make sure that the exams are relatively free from bias towards specific racial and ethnic groups and other demographics as well. I'm talking about race and ethnicity, but there's also evidence that these exams make it harder for older clinicians to reach licensure, and certainly that they make it harder for clinicians for whom English is not their first language to reach licensure. Because again, part of what we're dealing with is like English language comprehension, which is really separate from your knowledge of the profession or your ability to practice safely. There are a number of other researchers, especially in social work, that are offering other avenues of criticism of social work exams, but also kind of the exam process in mental health care writ large. And so there is this uh, really growing body of literature about the significant problems with our exam process as it exists today. And there is not a corresponding body of literature in support. Again, no study has ever shown a correlation between exam performance and your safety or effectiveness in actual clinical practice. So that body of literature is um, becoming more convincing by the day, I would say.
That's very interesting. What about the alternative that you have in mind?
Thank you. Yeah, the alternatives. Um, so I don't think there should be one.
Mm.
And I don't say that lightly. I don't mean to be glib about it, but uh, the process of becoming a therapist in the US is already tremendously challenging. It is long, it is expensive. The minimum graduate degree for licensure that you need today is a 60-unit master's degree. Go back to the 1980s, it was a 36-unit master's
Ah,
degree. And there's also no evidence that making that education longer made us any better or any safer. It just made it more difficult to become a therapist, which, okay, fine, so be it. Um, After you complete the master's degree, you're still talking usually about 2 years or more of supervised experience before you can obtain mental health licensure. This is a long, expensive, arduous process. And some of those standards were put in place, like the supervision standard for licensure came out of the world of psychology about 100 years ago. And when it was put into place in psychology, it was put in place with the explicit intent of slowing down the pipeline into licensure, which, okay, fine. 2 years or 3,000 hours, it's an arbitrary line. I'm okay with there being an arbitrary line. You got to put it somewhere. But if the original intention was to control the pipeline into licensure, which is understandable, well, today we are in a very different historical moment. Not just in the US, but around the world, there is tremendous demand for mental health care. And so if the original standard was meant as something of a pipeline control, well, today, when we need a whole lot of additional therapists to meet the need of our communities, let's use those standards as a pipeline control and allow more people in. And quite frankly, the easiest way to do that, the simplest way to do that, without appearing to compromise in any way on the safety or effectiveness of care, is to get rid of the clinical exams,
Mm.
to take those people who right now have fulfilled all of their other requirements for licensure except the clinical exam. I say that they're in clinical exam purgatory, and just let them in. In California alone, we have about 4,000 clinicians who are in clinical exam purgatory. They've done everything else. The only thing they have not done is pass the clinical exam for licensure. And man, 4,000 new licensed clinicians would sure go a long way to meeting the immediate mental health workforce crisis.
Wow.
So I think we shouldn't replace the exams with anything. I think we should let the education and supervision, which is already very, very rigorous, be enough.
Yeah, yeah. Ben, you're talking about it obviously very passionately. So I imagine you like going to the White House or somewhere advocating for this.
I'm a thorn in the side of our licensing board, to be sure.
Okay. But what we are talking about, it seems like the process that we have with the mission that the board or all these different boards they have, like the process does not take us to that mission, right? So somehow, if we think about it in a kind of like realm or world of psychometric, it's like we are designing a measure which does not measure what we are talking about, which seems
Right.
funny, right? And one thing that I always think, Ben, and I don't know if you agree with that, is I think it's funny how we are serious and challenging about the whole thing just before like getting your license, and then once you're licensed, you're all free. And I actually think that, or I wish sometimes that there was some sort of requirement for supervision even after your license. It doesn't need to be every like 10 hours or every week. It could be every month, but and if I'm not wrong, it is that same thing in the Europe that when you're licensed, you still need to have supervision. And I wish that was the same thing in the US because it seems like we have all these different barriers, but once the gate is open and you are on the other side, then you're just free. And yeah, so sometimes I don't hear good stories about that.
Well, Afron, I totally agree with you. And um, the way that licensure works here in the US, we tend to rely on continuing education to keep folks current and ensure that they are as safe and effective as they can be. And you want to talk about a lack of research support, there is very little research support for the notion that continuing education actually serves its intended purpose of keeping people current and up to date in their practices. There was a former CEO of AAMFT, the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy, who I was talking with him at a conference one time. This is years and years ago, and he said this thing. He wasn't taking credit for the quote. He was sort of passing along somebody else's quote, but the quote was that psychotherapy seems to be the one healthcare profession where you can continue practicing today the way that you were practicing 30 years ago and not be considered hopelessly out of date. And I thought that was fascinating because our field does have a lot to offer today in terms of guidance for professionals, really helpful notions about how to practice in a way that is fully empathetic, understanding of client circumstances, in keeping with modern understanding of mental health. There's so much that really does evolve over time. And if you, as a therapist, especially in private practice, haven't evolved with the field, like as long as you're not committing egregious violations of law or ethical standards, we don't really have a mechanism for doing anything about that.
Yes.
And you can argue maybe that's not a big deal. Maybe it's okay if somebody is a like a psychodynamic therapist or even a CBT therapist who's practicing the same way now that they were 30 years ago. So maybe they're not aware of the movement toward recovery-oriented care or trauma-informed care, but what they're doing is not harmful. It's helping most of the people who come to see them. You know, Maybe that's all right. I think that is a difficult question in its own right.
I agree. So, Ben, I know that we have a limited time, and I want to get to like more details about like how to become successful in these exams, right? So, if I was an applicant and then I'm watching this video, I want to know more about how I can prepare for the exams better. I know that better. I know that I was a student. I studied my PhD program in North Carolina, so I was licensed there. And then when I came to to California, I had to take the ethics exam. And at that time, I didn't know you in person, but I got your book and I loved the sample questions. Obviously, I was familiar with the content, but I loved the sample question. They were just so helpful because I answered them and I was like, this was great. And then I look at them like, this is wrong because I missed something in the question, right? And I actually have many of your book here.
Oh, thank you. That's kind of you.
Yeah, very helpful. But could you please talk about that? If I was an applicant and I'm preparing for the exam, what should I do?
Well, first of all, thank you. I appreciate your putting up the books, and I'm glad that my work has been helpful to you. That's wonderful to hear. It warms my heart every time I hear that. So thank you very much. Um, if you're an applicant and you're in the process of getting ready for exams, um, I guess the first thing I would say is that even if you are very confident in your knowledge base, as a lot of folks are, because our education, our supervision often prepares us very well, that's not necessarily enough to be ready for the exams. An exam is sort of its own beast, and it is not simply a test of knowledge. If it were a fully accurate assessment of knowledge, then you'd probably be fine. But because it is its own mechanism for evaluating, it's really helpful to understand how questions are going to be asked. And it's really helpful to, of course, manage your anxiety in that exam process. To the point of how questions are going to be asked, there are a lot of things where taking practice tests and then reading the rationales for what is the right answer can be really, really helpful in understanding just the mechanics of item writing. So I think about the law and ethics exams here in California, just as an example. And in real practice, of course, we have to comply with everything all of the time. You're always interested in being both legally and ethically compliant. But for the purposes of the exam, it's only going to ask about one of those segments at a time. It's going to ask about legal compliance, or it's going to ask about ethical compliance. And sometimes the wrong answers are things that you actually would do in that situation, in that vignette that's presented to you. But what makes them wrong answers is that the question asks, what should you do to facilitate legal compliance here?
Exactly.
And the answer options have to do with ethical compliance. And you might rightly think as a clinician, well, I would do all of those things. But you have to key in on specifically what the question is asking for. If they are asking for a legal response, you need to provide a legal response, even if the other things are also things that you would do.
Mhm.
Similarly, on a clinical exam, it's not unusual to see questions about sort of putting steps in the right order. Which of the following should the clinician do first? Or which of the following should the clinician do next? Which of the following would be an appropriate immediate response, right? And all of those things, all of those words in a question should key you into the sort of order of operations, right? You're going to handle any crisis issues first. You're going to assess before you intervene. You got to make sure that you're holding those things in order. And again, the response options might all genuinely be things that you think, yeah, I would do that here. But if the question asks, what should the therapist do now? Or what should the therapist do next? Then it's really saying take these options and put them in order and do the one that you would do or select the one that you would do first. So there's a lot of test prep that is about that kind of thing, making sure that you are understanding not just the knowledge of the profession, but also the various ways in which the questions will try to I don't want to use the word trick because it doesn't quite fit. They're not trying to trick you, but they are asking in ways that are technical to the exam process. And so you need to understand that component of item writing and keying in on the specific language of the question to make sure that your response is attuned to that.
I couldn't agree more. The most common mistakes that I did in those mock exams or questions, it was the same thing. But I, sorry, I read a question, I'm like, this is easy, you know, I got this, and A, correct. But then, you know, you go back and you see that, no, actually they were asking about the legal part. And or even sometimes, like, I forget this is the ethics exam, so I choose the clinical answer for the
Yeah.
question. So all those different things. So what I'm hearing is you suggest that they study about the content, and also the sample questions could be really helpful for them, because it kind of like give them a taste of the real questions that they're going to experience. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think back to when I was going through the exam process to become licensed myself. And at that time, I was teaching in a doctoral program. So I felt like, you know what, my knowledge base is pretty solid here. But what I did do before my own exam was I sort of gobbled up whatever sample tests out there or practice tests I could find for the purpose of getting used to how the questions are written and to figure out what kind of mistakes I would be making. And just like you know, I'm knowledgeable in the profession. You're very knowledgeable in the profession. Like it wasn't an issue of a problem with the knowledge base. It was very much about getting in tune with how these kinds of questions are going to be asked. And I was glad I did.
Wait. So if I do all these different things and I pass the exam, and I want to use more services, is there any more services support at HiPass that I can use after getting licensed?
Yeah, so we do continuing education. We're going to be continuing to build out our CE library
Mhm.
in the months and years ahead. As it is right now, we've got a 6-hour supervision course. We actually got a couple of them up on our site, including one that I really like. It was just fun to do. It's a course called Supervision for Clinical Effectiveness, and it's all about these exercises that you can do in supervision as a supervisor focused on helping your supervisees to actually become more clinically effective in their work. You know, there's a lot of research to suggest that what we typically do in supervision actually isn't the stuff that makes clinicians better. But with the knowledge base that we have now, particularly around deliberate practice, you know, there are a number of authors, people way smarter than me, who've come up with these great exercises that supervisors can do with supervisees to really hone in on specific micro skills that therapists can improve through supervision to become more effective overall. And so that course just gives a whole bunch of examples and demonstrations of exercises like that. Um, we also have right now a law and ethics course for associates, so pre-licensed folks on our site, but it won't be long before we have a 6-hour law and ethics for licensees as well. And our library is going to be continuing to grow, and I'm looking forward to some of the stuff that we have in the pipeline there too.
Awesome. Any future directions, anything else that you want to share about HiPass education? Any research that you may start in the future? I know, I'm just asking.
So we've got, I'd say, some exciting stuff in the pipeline. Um, and some of it I can't announce yet, even though I'm so excited about it. Like I've seen what it looks like, and I cannot wait. Um, but what I will say is this, you know, we're going to be continuing, like I said, to build out our CE course library. We're working on a lot of things in exam prep as well. We've got one big project that we are working on, probably for release later this year, that I think, I hope, I believe, really will meaningfully set us apart in how we prepare folks for their licensing exams. I can't say much more about it than that right now, much as I want to.
I understand.
I'll leave it at that.
You want us to stay curious. We will stay curious.
Yes.
That's fine. Okay, thank you so much, Ben, for your time. I really appreciate it. I know how busy you are, so thank you for taking this time with our journal and the YouTube channel. So I'm really excited about sharing this video with the applicants and students. I'm sure they would love it.
Well, Afrin, thank you so much. I appreciate the good, smart questions. It's always good to talk with you. It's I appreciate your taking the time as well. You're not exactly sitting around with nothing to do, so I really appreciate your taking the time for this.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.